Harold Bloom hated David Foster Wallace, and today we are going to hear Bloom take cheap shot after cheap shot at Wallace. But what makes this great is that Wallace responded. This is the Biggie and Tupac beef in the 90s, but in the 90s. This is the Kendrick and Drake beef. But instead of two industry plants, we have two people with a brain. Even though I do like Kendrick. And if you guys don't already know, Right Conscious is the headquarters of everything related to David Foster Wallace here on YouTube. We do deep dives into his books, his life, his essays, and so many other things. And go check out the playlist down below for over 50 videos on Wallace, with new videos dropping daily. And so let us now hear from Bloom. Quote, asked about novelist David Foster Wallace, who took his own life in 2008, but who has a new book out, The Pale King, an unfinished novel, put together from manuscript chapters and files found in his computer, Bloom says, I don't want to be offensive, but Infinite Jest is just awful. It seems ridiculous to have to say it. He can't think. He can't write. There's no discernible talent. It's all a clear indication, Bloom notes, of the decline of literary standards. He was upset in 2003 when the National Book Award gave a special award to Stephen King. But Stephen King is Cervantes compared with David Foster Wallace. We have no standards left. Wallace seems to have been a very sincere and troubled person, but that doesn't mean I have to endure reading him. I even resented the use of the term from Shakespeare when Hamlet calls the king's jester Yorick a fellow of infinite jest. It's sort of a dark time. Imaginative energy, I think, is very difficult to summon up when there are so many distractions. There's a kind of Grisham's law in literature: the bad drives out the good. And so before we hear from Wallace and his response, there are a couple of different things that we need to go over here. And it all stems back to marketing campaigns, because to really make a splash in literary fiction, you need a big push. In the UFC or in boxing, a push is when the company or the promoter really gets behind someone and makes their story a focal point. Years ago, that was Conor McGregor. Recently, Sean Strickland kind of got an industry push. But it's the same with writers. And what does a push mean? It's not just getting someone's face out into the world. It's telling their story. It's branding them literally. And David Foster Wallace, when he released Infinite Jest, underwent a massive rebranding of his character. Before the book came out, his publishing house was sending people direct mail saying, are you going to be able to finish Infinite Jest, the unfinishable novel? They were making it a challenge. They were talking about this writer who had been lost in his own mind, working on this masterpiece for 10 years. And it's so hard that most people aren't going to be able to finish it, but it's a masterpiece. And for someone who is smart, like I'm sure you are, when you are put to a challenge, especially an intellectual one, by some random publishing house, you might want to step up and do it. And maybe you're smart enough to see past that gimmick. But what was interesting about that gimmick was that they were using direct mail. We now have email marketing or social media marketing, advertisements on YouTube or something, Amazon ads. And there's also marketing like this. I'm sure that you have always wanted to read Infinite Jest. Maybe you've not completed it. Well, if you want to read Infinite Jest with me and a group and follow along with my Infinite Jest course, which will be released every single week before the book club meets, you should join my Infinite Jest book club and David Foster Wallace course. We will also be reading 2 other books in the David Foster Wallace book club, and in the Right Conscious book club at large, we read 8 to 10 books at a time. I have a writing group that helps get you writing every single day. I do writing sprints daily. I have office hours daily if you can't make the book clubs. And I also have a David Foster Wallace course and a Cormac McCarthy course. So I would love to have you if you are interested in that. But if you are short on money, God bless your soul, you can save up and one day join us, maybe when there's hundreds of hours of content so you can digest it all at once. But I also offer a free document on over 400 of David Foster Wallace's favorite books and authors. So if you haven't got that yet, I will put the link to both of those things down below, and I would love to see you guys in the course. But still, to this day, one of the most effective forms of marketing is specialized direct mail marketing. And their campaign worked, and the whole world kind of fell into a frenzy over Wallace. And I think Bloom felt very resentful about this because he makes some egregious errors in his analysis here. When he says he can't think, that's obviously a lie. David Foster Wallace was a very smart individual. I see people in my comments all the time talking about David's wrong, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, guys, you are not as smart as him. Like, everyone has their own errors and false perceptions and these types of things. But in terms of knowledge about the humanities and about writing, he has much more of it than 99% of people who call themselves intellectuals. And this is very apparent in his nonfiction essays, which, in my opinion, are very readable. Some are a little bit too avant-garde for me, like Host and Consider the Lobster. I'm kind of like, okay. And the same can be said in many sections of Infinite Jest, but I think Bloom got hung up on some of the more negative aspects of Wallace's writing, which I am very happy to talk about, because if you are a fan of David Foster Wallace, you have been there before when you were reading his book and you start not skipping pages, but like looking like, how many more fucking pages do I have of this chapter? Because you're like, first of all, I may have no idea what's going on. And what's funny about Infinite Jest, sometimes it's just a wall of text. There's no paragraph break. There's no sentence break. Sometimes it's just a sentence for 2 pages, or there's a couple punctuation marks and you're like, oh my God. And it's about some character you don't care about and some chronology in the plot that's seemingly unknown to you at that time. And even worse, Wallace's probably most negative attribute is that his writing can feel not flat, but almost like what complicated AI will be like 5 years down the road when it starts to write novels. When you read, for instance, like his short stories in The Girl with Curious Hair, it can be hard to get through. Like, sometimes you're like, oh my God, like, I understand there's some beauty here, and he's talented and the sentences are good, but it seems a little too hard for the Lexile level. You know, like, it seems like I'm slogging a little too hard to get through this. And there are times, because Wallace was only about a decade removed from that period in his life, where he falls into that in Infinite Jest. And sometimes those sections last 30 pages. And this is why it's one of the most unfinished novels, because you have no idea where you're at in the timeline and you're stuck with somebody that you don't necessarily care about. But for him to say there's no discernible talent, I would like to ask, there is an answer. But when you look at how Wallace writes, for instance, about addiction, I would, place him near the top of the mountain about what, I've read about addiction. Because I've read first-person POV novels about addiction, where we are dealing with an addict who's going through it, and I'm feeling the pain and the anxiety, and I start feeling weird in my own skin because the writing's so good. But Wallace takes a different approach, and no spoilers here, with like Don Gately and stuff, and with the Halfway House, because we're looking at different characters. We're kind of getting a 5,000 feet above look at some of these characters, and then they kind of correspond with a lot of other aspects in the novel, which also relate to addiction and consumption. There's kind of this overarching narrative that makes it feel a little bit more full, but it doesn't get into like fetish size, like a fetish of addiction, or just addiction porn writing where we are, trapped in someone's mind. And he does do that at times. There are certain anecdotes where we hear someone give a speech like about their life to Alcoholics Anonymous, and he goes on for 10 pages about someone's story, but we're very quickly out of that. But there is talent there. There's also the talent to be able to write such a complex novel that almost mirrors, the complexity of Gravity's Rainbow, at a lesser level, in my opinion. But that's one of the hallmarks, I would say, of modern literature is experimental form, writing something that's very long, doing different things. Like, to be able to be progressive in that regard and be somewhat successful, even if you don't like Wallace, requires a great degree of talent. I could barely keep my room organized. I can, my files on my computer and the poetry books I'm assembling, and that's poetry. I can't imagine what Wallace, who did a lot of this by hand, was dealing with in organizing Infinite Jest. And I think Bloom also equates Wallace's content, characters that have mental illnesses, characters with weird sex fetishes, with addictions. There's so many wacky things in the novel, and like the humorous stuff also. I think he equates a lot of that with kind of like the degradation of language and culture, which one could say is true, but it's a little bit silly. Today I read a comment. I get comments like this often, but it's a big block, 8 paragraphs. And, I was down to listen to this video, but then when you said the F word, I'm out. English is already a bastardized language and you're ruining it. And then and they start speaking in cryptic words about the occult. I'm like, Jesus Christ. And I talk about all the time about the degradation of culture and language, and I'm witnessing it as a high school teacher of 7 years. Every single, year by year, it's getting worse and worse, and it's not just because that's what happens because of COVID and TikTok and Red Dye 40. Like, it's accelerating at a massive rate. Like, this isn't my own paranoia. But Bloom seems to forget that the canon was very progressive. One of my favorite arguments for the canon is like, hey, maybe today these guys were racist or sexist or whatever else, but most people in the canon at the time were very progressive. I mean, they're writers. They're these like avant-garde writers of their time. And when you look at their politics and a lot of their views, obviously now ours, a lot of it is regressive, but at the time they were very progressive. And I think that's what, how you stake your claim in the canon. Most authors, and I know there's exceptions, and it's usually about 100-year window, like War and Peace was writing about, the Napoleonic times and about, things of that nature. But for, when Tolstoy was alive, I think that was still within 100 years of his lifetime. Well, I'm very sure. And I think that's kind of the window that you have with what you're able to write about. William T. Vollmann comes to mind with this very good novel, probably one of the best World War II novels ever written, especially if you're into like more complicated stuff, Europe Central. But I would assume like 50 years from now, let's say, maybe even less, like 30 years from now, after 100 years after World War II, when people write about World War II again, it's going to seem a bit weird. It's almost going to be played out, even though it is the Great War. Even today, when you look at like a lot of work about World War II, it's just becoming super meta, and like on Amazon there's tens of thousands of books written by old people, young people, whoever, about the different aspects of World War II, and aliens have been added, and Moroccan erotica with Rommel. Like, I'm sure there's everything on there. And Wallace is still cutting edge to this day. I mean, when I look back, he was right almost about everything about where we were going. And I would say that it's better to be talking about it and be inundated. I'd rather hear from someone who is a part of the movement than the old person who is saying this is all bad. When boomers or whoever talk about TikTok or these things now, I cringe because they don't really understand, and they haven't seen the good side of social media, like what we're engaging in right now. And Bloom is off his rocker when he says, but Stephen King is Cervantes compared with David Foster Wallace. We have no standards left. I mean, I think King at his best is a decent writer. There are some novels he's written that I've enjoyed. I mean, a lot of what he writes is, absolute shit, which is fine because he produces a novel a year and it's just kind of a business now. And he keeps a high pace. It's hard to, do that over a long period of time. I think you can do that. Faulkner famously wrote, some books in like a month or two, and other people, had these bouts of passion. But, Rilke, my favorite poet, or one of them, wrote the Duino Elegies and Sonnets to Orpheus in like 2 weeks, and those are considered some of the greatest poetry books of all time. But Rilke didn't write a poem for like 5 or 6 years before that. He was waiting for the inspiration to come. And a lot of the time, it's also just a young man's game. You have this energy, you have this calling. And as you get older and you're arguing with people about politics on Twitter, you don't really have that type of energy. And Bloom, does fall into the trap of viewing literary fiction as the highest art. Even though I make fun of all my sci-fi lovers out there and my fantasy lovers, I'm a huge fan of both genres. Even mystery novels. I read mystery novels. I am engaged in. I read thrillers occasionally. Like, I understand when something's good, it's really good. And if it can transform your life, which obviously sci-fi and fantasy can do much easier than a thriller or a mystery, then that's all that really matters. Like, Dune changed my life. Like, if you read all 6 Dune books and apply that knowledge about government and the world and where we're going, and you study it at a deeper level and like go to the weird Dune forums and stuff and like, nerd out, like it changed my life. It's up there with any other author, any other movie, any other thing. Maybe it hasn't beat my like decade-long meditation practice or yoga or family and nature and stuff, but in terms of knowledge, it's at the top. But Bloom seems to have this kind of problem with it because it isn't in the same tradition, and a lot of people sometimes feel that way, and I think that's just really dumb. And Bloom once again gets it wrong here when he says that imaginative energy is hard to muster up with all these distractions. And that's true. But there are people out there like Wallace who are distracted, who do engage with technology and these things, and they use that to their benefit. They remanipulate that energy. And we have to ask yourself, why is there so much bad literature now? And it's a double multiplier. First of all, being that the general population has kind of lessened in intelligence and lessened in their interest for literary fiction. And then second, it's the collapse of the meritocracy in traditional publishing houses. And that, which has been going on for decades, has kind of signaled to a lot of talented people that, hey, I really shouldn't take this up. Like, this is kind of a lost cause, which it is. And it's really classist in nature because we have this fake upliftment of certain groups of people through diversity quotas or these things, and that's fine. But the problem is that money isn't going to be there forever. The MFA farm, these types of things are silly because if you can't make people care about your writing, if it's actually not good and you're just getting paid and it's like money falling down the tank, it's not going to work out. The Saudi Arabians put on boxing events and MMA fights and these things because they just have money to spend. They don't care if they lose $50 million. They just laugh it off. And that's cool. But publishing houses are failing and the industry is shrinking because they have been doing this, but they don't have this unlimited oil well of money. And this isn't about race, even though it has been made about race with these quotas, it's really about class. Because when I look literally at almost every single author that has been highly successful, they came from an affluent background or a background that they started with parents who were highly educated, or they were highly educated and eventually transitioned. Even if they seem to have a rugged appearance or character, they transitioned into being these great authors. Even like I mentioned earlier, William T. Vollmann went to the most prestigious college in the country, Deep Springs College, and then eventually transferred to Ivy League schools and like yada, yada, yada. Even people like Toni Morrison, who worked before she became an author at a very prestigious publishing house. That was an in. And it seemed that, the opportunities for authors in the lower middle class and lower class are shrinking every single year because, a lot of people don't want to have to sell their soul to universities. A lot of people don't want to have to starve for decades. And there's been so much negative programming and talk, and it's true that there are no opportunities left for greatness to be rewarded in the world, the literary world. But that problem has been accentuated by the publishing houses, but also by a lot of us. A lot of authors out there have refused to do any form of self-promotion. And I'm not talking about getting on TikTok or a YouTube video like this and speaking. I'm just talking about starting a free Substack, releasing some of their work for free, maybe trying to get some blog posts going or something, and they can sit behind their screen and never show their face, but get some form of interest going in their work. When there is an outright refusal, to do that, then we're also killing ourselves. And I see this every single day because I'm here. I'm trying to convince you guys to do better and make way for good literature so that we can write consciously. And I hear every single excuse. I don't want to do that. I shouldn't have to be able to do that. Like, it's endless. And so that is why we are dying. I really don't think it's the distractions, because the distractions have helped me become a better writer. I think I'm stronger than I would have been if I was born in the 1950s, because of all this stuff I've been exposed to. So let us now hear from Wallace. And in Infinite Jest, which happened before this, so maybe Bloom was still angry about this. In footnote 366, Wallace writes about Bloom. Quote, sounding rather suspiciously like Professor H. Bloom's turgid studies of artistic influenza, though it's unclear how either Flood or Dead Ancestor discussions have any connection to S. Peterson's low-budget classic The Cage, which is mostly about peripatetic eyeball rolling around, other than the fact that J.O. Incandenza loved this film and stuck little snippets of it or references to it just about anywhere he could. Maybe the disjunction or disconnection between the screen's film and PhD's scholastic discussion of art is part of the point. And so Wallace actually does a play on here because Bloom is obviously known for his anxiety of influence. But when Wallace says artistic influenza, he's kind of talking about the influence, an influence spread among artists. And he also calls his work turgid, which means, difficult to digest, which I think is, which is true. Like, Bloom can be very dry at times and really comes across purposefully as dry. And Wallace finally makes the point about the disconnect between academics like Bloom. Bloom has a novel on a Gnostic novel, if you guys want to go see his own writing ability, and art. That's why I try to write a poem every single day and put it on the Substack, release a longer prose piece of fiction every single week, because I want to show you guys that I'm here. Maybe I'm not the best, but I'm here trying to improve with you guys right now, and I'm not trying to be like a dick, because I'm not the greatest writer. I'm trying to be, but it really sucks when you see these professors who don't release any books and they're teaching creative writing, or they're talking about writing in literature, but they don't have a stake in the hand. And I find that annoying. And I do understand that, for instance, and this doesn't really apply it actually doesn't apply. I was gonna say, like, there are some MMA coaches that have never done MMA before, but they've always done at least one aspect of martial arts. Maybe they were a jujitsu practitioner or a boxer or a kickboxer, whatever. And then they came in and then they, eventually figured out some of the other elements, and they have other specialists training the people, and they're just the head coach putting it all together and kind of barking out the commands. But someone who has never written or published real writing trying to act like they have opinions, that's crazy. And I don't think we should listen to people like that. And that's why I think academia and those types of things are overrated and we need to move away from them. So what do you guys think of Harold Bloom's analysis? I know some of you guys absolutely hate David Foster Wallace. Some of you, and some of you love them. So what did you think of his criticisms? Obviously, I thought it was really silly. And I will see you guys very soon in a kind of flood of Infinite Jest videos, because I am starting to create the Infinite Jest course and the book club, and it's really one of the only things I'm reading right now, time and over and over again. So I just have like a lot to say about it. So I will see you guys in those videos. Peace.